When you picture prison, you probably imagine men, gangs on the yard, steel doors slamming, voices echoing down concrete halls. But behind those same walls, another story plays out, one most people never see. Women shackled while giving birth, mothers forced to say goodbye to newborns hours after delivery, cells designed for men that don't account for menstruation, pregnancy, or trauma, guards who abuse the power of silence. These are not just inmates. They're mothers, daughters, survivors, caught in a system that was never built for them. And once you step into their world, you realize prison doesn't just lock them up. It takes pieces of their identity, their families, and their futures. This is the untold story of women in prison. For most of history, there was no such thing as a women's prison. When women were arrested, they were thrown into the same facilities as men. Same cells, same treatment, same dangers. And because the system was designed for men, women often endured even harsher conditions. They were outnumbered, overlooked, and left unprotected in violent environments where abuse was rampant. In the 19th century, reformers started to push for change. They argued that women needed separate facilities, not because of equality, but because of morality. The Victorian idea was that women could be reformed into better wives, mothers, and caretakers if they were separated from men. So women's reformatories were born. Places that looked less like prisons and more like institutions meant to reshape behavior. These facilities emphasized domestic work, sewing, cooking, laundry. The idea wasn't rehabilitation in the modern sense, it was control, wrapped in the language of morality. But even with separate facilities, the shadow of the male prison system never left. Women's prisons were smaller, often underfunded, and treated as afterthoughts. While men's prisons expanded and adapted over time, women's prisons lagged behind. The system still assumed that incarceration was primarily a male problem, and women were treated as exceptions to the rule. By the 20th century, as incarceration rates rose in the United States and beyond, women's prisons began to mirror men's prisons more closely. Barbed wire, cell blocks, solitary confinement, the same structures, just scaled down. But the design flaws were obvious. These facilities weren't built for women's needs. They didn't provide adequate health care for pregnancy or gynecology. They didn't consider the fact that most incarcerated women were survivors of abuse themselves, carrying deep trauma into a place that offered no therapy or support. The irony is sharp. Reformatories were created to protect women from men in mixed prisons, but the new generation of women's prisons failed them in a different way, by ignoring their realities. The system had simply copied the blueprint of men's incarceration and applied it to women, with no consideration for their differences. And as prison populations exploded during the war on drugs in the 1980s and 1990s, women's incarceration skyrocketed. Suddenly, facilities built for hundreds had to hold thousands. Women were swept into the system at rates never seen before, mostly for non-violent offenses, drug possession, low-level trafficking, survival crimes. Yet the system treated them with the same blunt force it used on men. So the history of women's prisons is really the story of being overlooked. First, shoved into men's prisons, then pushed into moralistic reformatories, and finally, forced into carbon copies of men's facilities that never accounted for their realities. That's why today, when you look inside women's prisons, you see the legacy of neglect. Cells not designed for women's bodies. Healthcare systems that fail pregnant inmates. Programs that ignore the trauma so many carry. The history explains the present. A system built without women in mind can't possibly serve them justly. To understand women in prison, you first have to understand who they are, and just as importantly, who they aren't. The stereotype is hardened criminals, gang leaders, killers. But in reality, the majority of women behind bars don't fit that image at all. Most incarcerated women are there for nonviolent crimes, drug possession, low-level trafficking, shoplifting, fraud, survival crimes like writing bad checks or stealing food. Many are imprisoned not for acts of violence, but for acts of desperation. And when you trace the roots of their cases, a pattern emerges: poverty, addiction, and trauma. The numbers tell the story. A huge percentage of incarcerated women lived below the poverty line before their arrest. Many are single mothers trying to provide for children in impossible circumstances. For some, selling drugs isn't about empire, it's about keeping the lights on. Shoplifting isn't about greed, it's about diapers or groceries. The law may call these crimes, but behind them are stories of survival in a system that already failed them. Then there's the role of abuse. Study after study shows that most incarcerated women are survivors of physical or sexual violence long before they ever entered prison. Many grew up in households marked by trauma. Others endured abusive relationships as adults, where crime was less a choice than a trap. Some committed crimes under coercion, pressured, or forced by partners, pimps, or family members. Their criminal record ends up being the final chapter in a long story of victimization. Add addiction to the mix. Drugs and alcohol are often coping mechanisms for pain, and that dependency drives many women into the justice system. Possession, DUIs, small-scale dealing, crimes tied to substances become the pipeline that feeds women's incarceration. But the system rarely treats addiction as illness. It punishes it instead, locking women into cells rather than clinics. The demographic patterns are stark too. Women of color are disproportionately represented, especially Black and Latino women in the United States. Structural racism, biased policing, and sentencing disparities all funnel marginalized women into prisons at higher rates. The pipeline is not just personal, it's systemic. And hovering over all of it is motherhood. Nearly 80% of incarcerated women are mothers. That means every sentence carries a ripple effect beyond the walls. Children lose parents. Families are fractured. In many cases, kids are placed in foster care, creating generational cycles of trauma that stretch far beyond the prison gates. When you put all these pieces together, the picture becomes clear. Women aren't entering prison the same way men are. They're not flooding in from violent gang wars or large-scale organized crime. They're being pulled in by poverty, addiction, abuse, and systems stacked against them. They carry the weight of survival, trauma, and motherhood into facilities that aren't built to handle any of it. That's the real pipeline. Not a straight line from crime to punishment, but a spiral from pain to prison. And once you see that, the whole system looks less like justice, and more like punishment layered on top of suffering that was already there. Walk into almost any women's prison in the world, and there's one fact that hits harder than any steel door or barbed wire fence. Most of the women inside are mothers. Some were arrested while pregnant. Some gave birth in custody. Others left children behind the moment the handcuffs clicked. The statistics are staggering. Nearly 80% of incarcerated women are mothers, and many are the primary caregivers for their children. That means when a woman goes to prison, an entire family often falls apart with her. The separation begins brutally. In most cases, women are not allowed to keep their children with them. Babies are taken within hours or days of birth, handed over to relatives, foster care, or the system. For mothers, the trauma is indescribable. Giving birth in shackles, then being forced to say goodbye almost immediately. It's a punishment that extends far beyond the sentence written on paper. Some prisons have nursery programs that allow mothers to keep infants with them for limited periods. And inside the walls, being a mother doesn't get easier. Phone calls cost money many women don't have. Letters can take weeks to arrive. Visitation rules are strict, and travel distances make it nearly impossible for families living in poverty to visit regularly. Every missed birthday, every Christmas without mom, every goodbye through a sheet of plexiglass deepens the wound. There are also the unseen punishments. Some mothers lose custody permanently, others have parental rights terminated while serving long sentences. For them, prison isn't just the loss of freedom, it's the loss of identity itself. Because once you strip motherhood away, what's left? The tragedy is that many of these women were locked up for nonviolent offenses, survival crimes, low-level drug charges, yet their punishment cascades onto children who did nothing wrong. Entire families serve the sentence together, even if only one name is on the paperwork. Still, within this heartbreak, there are glimmers of resilience. Some prisons offer parenting classes or programs where mothers can record themselves reading books for their children, the tapes mailed home to keep bonds alive. Some women find strength in planning for the day they'll reunite with their kids, clinging to hope like oxygen. But the truth remains brutal. Incarcerated motherhood isn't just a personal tragedy, it's a social one. Every time a mother is locked away, children are left behind, often more damaged by her absence than by her crime. And the system rarely sees that cost, because it's not written in the sentence. Behind the fences, the most haunting sound isn't the clanging of doors, it's the silence of a child growing up without their mother. If there's one place where the failure of women's prisons is most obvious, it's healthcare. The system was built for men, and when women entered in larger numbers, no one redesigned it to fit their needs. The result is a crisis that plays out quietly behind walls. Women denied basic medical care, pregnancies mishandled, and even menstruation treated like a privilege instead of a necessity. Start with pregnancy. In many facilities, prenatal care is minimal, sometimes non-existent. Women report going weeks without seeing a doctor, even while pregnant. Stories of mothers being forced to give birth while shackled are not rare. Wrists and ankles chained during labor, a practice condemned by medical associations worldwide. The logic is security, but the reality is cruelty. For mothers, the experience leaves lasting trauma. For newborns, it can mean complications that never should have happened. Then there are miscarriages. Countless lawsuits tell the same story. Women in prison begging for help while bleeding, doubled over in pain, ignored by guards who assume they're exaggerating. Hours later, they lose pregnancies that might have been saved with basic medical attention. Each one is a tragedy hidden by concrete walls. Even outside of pregnancy, gynecological care is woefully inadequate. Pap smears, breast exams, and routine screenings are often delayed or skipped altogether. In some facilities, there may not be a gynecologist on staff at all. For women who already come from backgrounds of poverty and limited health care, this neglect can mean late diagnoses, untreated illnesses, and preventable deaths. And then there's the monthly reality, menstruation. Something every woman experiences, yet in prison, pads and tampons are often treated like contraband. Some prisons ration them, handing out only a few each month, nowhere near enough. Women end up bleeding through clothes, improvising with toilet paper, even scraps of fabric. The humiliation is constant and it's entirely avoidable. Mental health is another crisis. The majority of incarcerated women are survivors of trauma, physical abuse, sexual violence, addiction. Yet few prisons offer meaningful therapy or counseling. Instead, women are placed in solitary confinement when they break down. Depression and PTSD are met not with treatment, but with punishment, and the isolation only makes it worse. Defenders of the system sometimes argue that prisons can't be expected to provide full medical care, but the reality is that once someone is locked up, the state takes responsibility for their health. That responsibility is written into law, yet too often ignored in practice. The cruelty is quiet. It doesn't make headlines. It doesn't explode in riots. It unfolds in hospital wings, without doctors, in cells where women suffer in silence, in bodies that are treated as afterthoughts. This is what it means when people say the prison system wasn't built for women. It's not just about overcrowding or design. It's about the fact that their bodies, their health, their most basic needs are invisible in a system designed around men. And every ignored pregnancy, every rationed tampon, every untreated illness is proof that invisibility can be deadly. In prison, healthcare isn't a right. Too often, it's a gamble. And for women, the stakes are life, death, and dignity. Amid all the cruelty and neglect, there are stories that cut through the darkness. Women who refuse to let prison define them, who found strength in places designed to break them. Take the story of Susan Burton. She cycled in and out of prison for years, trapped by addiction and poverty. Each release ended in relapse. Each relapse led her back inside. But when she finally broke free, she didn't just rebuild her own life. She built a new way of life, a program in Los Angeles that helps other women coming out of prison find housing, jobs, and stability. Her story is living proof that resilience doesn't end at the gate. It begins there. Or think about Judy Clark, once an inmate at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, who earned her GED, went to college courses behind bars, and later became a mentor for women struggling inside. In a system that erases individuality, she carved out purpose by helping others survive. Education is often the lifeline. In prisons that allow it, women grab hold of classes as a way to fight despair. They study law so they can file appeals. They write poetry that gets published in small magazines. They create art that travels beyond the walls, telling stories no documentary could capture on its own. These are quiet rebellions, small acts of reclaiming humanity in a place built to strip it away. There are also women who turn their pain into activism. After release, some become advocates for prison reform, testifying before lawmakers about shackled births, healthcare neglect, or abuse by guards. Their scars become their strength. They remind the world that what happens inside women's prisons isn't hidden forever. It comes back out in voices that demand change. And then there are the everyday survivors, women who may never write books or build organizations, but who endure. The mother who records herself reading bedtime stories for her children so they'll hear her voice every night. The woman who learns meditation to survive solitary confinement. The friend who smuggles notes of encouragement from cell to cell just to remind others they're not forgotten. These stories matter because they show that resilience isn't just about escape or release. It's about resisting the erasure that prison imposes. It's about holding on to identity, dignity, and hope when everything around you says you don't deserve them. For every headline about violence or neglect, there are hundreds of untold stories of women who keep going anyway, who build communities inside, who protect each other, who find ways to laugh, to love, to create. It doesn't erase the cruelty of the system, but it proves that even in cages, humanity finds a way to breathe. And maybe that's what unsettles people most, because when you look closely at women in prison, you don't just see criminals, you see survivors, you see mothers, you see leaders in the making, and you start to wonder whether the system is wasting lives that could have become something more. So what does all of this tell us? That women in prison are not just inmates. They are the proof of a system built for men, a system that never stopped to ask what justice looks like when the person in the cell is a mother, a survivor, or someone fighting addiction. Their stories show us the cracks, prisons that fail to provide health care, guards who abuse power, children torn from mothers who were never violent to begin with, a cycle where poverty and trauma feed incarceration, and incarceration feeds more trauma. But they also show us resilience. Women who turn cells into classrooms, mothers who cling to their children through phone calls and letters, survivors who walk out and become voices for change. These women prove that even in the darkest conditions, humanity refuses to disappear. Because every time we fail a woman in prison, we don't just punish her. We punish her children, her family, her future, and in the end, that means we punish ourselves too by repeating a cycle that never ends. Stories that are darker, stranger, and more human than the headlines ever show, and together, we can pull them into the light.